Hi, my name is Gwen Johnson. I'm currently a junior studying science marketing, and I'm going to be presenting a paper about the intersection of science communication, which is the field I want to work in, and diversity studies. This paper was originally written for a diversity studies class. So I'm going to screen share the paper so that you can read it as I am reading it aloud. So let's scroll back up to the top. Diversity studies converses with the field of science communication in an interesting and important way regarding who in society is allowed to participate. For instance, women and people of color were historically not allowed in scientific circles, but now there are programs and initiatives designed specifically with these groups in mind. This is a complicated set of circumstances for trans individuals. One transmasculine friend of mine has discussed the fact that he has benefited immensely from programs for women in science and grew up being told he would be a role model for little girls. He has had to reconcile with the effects of this, as well as the fact that he can't necessarily just switch to being a role model for trans people because he is, at this point, unsure of what level of visibility he is comfortable with regarding that aspect of his identity. This provides an intriguing jumping-off point from my own perspective because it allows me to consider which aspects of my identity are inherently visible and which I can keep to myself, and what level of responsibility comes with each of those things. Two identity constructs that have almost always been seen in science are those of being white and financially well off, which I am. But three that have been significantly less frequent are those of the disabled asexual women, which I also am. Now, I'm not exactly sure what area of science communication I want to work in. Generally, I'm considering some form of science writing that is accessible to the general public. I say I'm not exactly sure because I have been informed that it is very difficult to make a living doing science writing in a traditional published format by itself. Also, multiple friends are of the opinion that I should start a podcast, which is an idea I initially thought was strange before realizing that I get most of my extracurricular science knowledge from science-based podcasts and YouTube channels rather than by reading articles. They need someone to write and host those things. This is where the identity constructs come in. Were I to choose a more public-facing profession, such as hosting a podcast or some other form of science show, my being a visibly disabled woman would be important in terms of allowing other people to see themselves be represented, but also in allowing those who normally do see themselves represented to realize that others belong in this space too. It would combat the danger of the single story, a story which for disabled people often involves being made into a lesson or inspirational figure for those around them. Conversely, the risk of being seen as exceptional increases when you are the one representative of a group in a room. In the introduction to her book, Crash Test Girl, former Mythbusters host Carrie Byron talks about how in the beginning of the show, she was the only woman in the room at big television events, and over the next 14 years, she saw that number increase. If I were in a similar position, there would be the risk of being sexualized as a woman, but also the tendency to be infantilized and desexualized as a disabled person. There's a strange kind of tension between these identities. Additionally, there's the risk of being seen as exceptional as a member of whichever group becomes highlighted, that I have done something better than the rest to get to where I am, when really I also have areas of my identity that provide me with privilege to help me get places, my whiteness and my class privilege. This being seen as exceptional or inspirational has its own tension as well, as Stella Young discusses the concept of inspiration porn as a form of objectification of disabled people through which other, mostly non-disabled people benefit. This inspiration feeling feels different when it applies to able-bodied versus disabled people. If I were to, in this situation, inspire a disabled person to go into science, that wouldn't make me uncomfortable. But the scenario of being seen as motivation for an able-bodied person, because if they can do it, I can do it, is incredibly patronizing and awful in a way that I can't quite articulate. It is objectifying in a way that the former situation is not. To tie in the identity construct of my asexuality, I would have no idea what to do in a situation where I was sexualized. That's not even a kind of attraction I experience. Combating the infantilization that sometimes comes with being disabled is fairly easy, at least in my experience, because people tend to stop baby talking at you when you inform them that, yes, I can understand you, and if you could please direct your questions at me, I will gladly consider how best to answer them. The desexualization I mind a bit less, except that people tend to automatically assume that you don't have any romantic interest as well, but that has nothing to do with my career. For a whole host of reasons, I don't really plan on bringing up my sexuality in any public-facing career. Firstly, there are the uncomfortable misunderstanding comments you get from people you know, exacerbated by the comment sections of the internet. Secondly, it's not really relevant to explaining science. I mean, representation is nice and valuable, but you also have to keep yourself safe. And that includes from internet trolls. There is something to be said for wearing something small like a bracelet or a pin with the Ace Pride colors on them. So then if you know, you know. And possibly bringing up the difference between the term as it is used in science and in the arena of sexuality. Many organisms reproduce asexually, such as yeasts and sometimes some types of fungi and bacteria, i.e., they reach a point where they divide in two, resulting in two genetically identical organisms. This is different from me not experiencing sexual attraction. Keeping it subtle might be a good choice because I have rarely felt the need to hide my sexuality, just to not mention it until it came up, unless it came up, excuse me. That way, people in the know could feel represented without opening myself up to nasty comments. Subtlety has never been an option with my disability, but that's okay, because it might help people to see me visibly disabled and there. No one has made mean comments about me being a disabled scientist. There's just been me feeling unhelpful for not being able to carry things in a lab. And being a woman in science? Well, I grew up during the big push for that, so it's only been brought to my attention as a good thing rather than an issue. Relatedly, I in most circumstances do not have the option of not disclosing the fact that I'm disabled, since a wheelchair is an incredibly visible thing. I am likewise not ashamed of it. I just know that people tend to treat me a certain way. A Zoom class without a working camera presented an interesting opportunity to see how people I didn't know responded to me before and after I introduced them to this particular fact, as do extended email correspondences before meeting someone in person. These situations also come with the questions of when you bring up the fact that you use a wheelchair. Do you bring it up right out of the gate so that people know and don't feel like you've been lying to them? Or do you play cool and let them form their own idea of you based on your ideas and the way you conduct yourself, and then spring it on them? With the former, you lose the short period of time where people aren't necessarily forming opinions of you based on any preconceived notions of disability. With the latter, people can sometimes feel betrayed and then have to go through all the work of fitting disability into their concept of you as a person, which is uncomfortable and involves breaking down some unconscious biases. That kind of control over how people perceive me, or this, that, or the other aspect of my identity, is not one I necessarily have all the time. Where someone like my brother has more control over his image, for lack of a better term, in part because he adheres more closely to the mythical norm and has a smaller number of marginalized groups to play representative for. The differences between my brother's identity and mine impact everything from how people treat us to our future living places. My brother gets around well enough that he could live anywhere, where I could only function in a large city. This in turn impacts a number of things, including cost of living. I started blogging my perspective to have input into how people think of me, but it is also useful in terms of my future career explaining unfamiliar topics to people, no matter what format. So thank you for listening to my paper on representation and diversity studies. There we are. The blog I mentioned is called thegirlinthechair.com. So if you have questions about this paper or any of my other writing, you can either use the contact form on that website or email me at gjohnson7918@mtmercy.edu. Thanks again for listening to my presentation, and have a nice day.